Hong Kong's security chief claims that terrorism is on the rise in the city as police arrest some 180 protesters during renewed unrest. Thousands took to the streets to protest Beijing's plans to impose a security law on that former British colony. It would bypass the local legislature and is expected to ban what China calls treason and sedition. Pro-democracy campaigners say it is a threat to Hong Kong's freedoms and semi-autonomy. Let's go now to the senior reporter, Laura Westbrook from Hong Kong newspaper, the South China Morning Post. She has more on the story for us. Good morning to you. We've seen a quick and heavy crackdown in Hong Kong. Is this a sign of a new and tougher approach by Beijing?
Yes, I think it is. The protests, which have been going on since last year, have become increasingly more violent, as we saw yesterday. And with slogans like revolution of our times and calls for Hong Kong independence by some of the more radical protesters, I think Beijing is saying that this is something that it no longer is willing to tolerate, and it sees the Hong Kong protests as a direct threat to national security. Over the past few months, Beijing has also made accusations of foreign interference in the protests. Now, the protesters deny this, and Beijing has not produced any evidence of outside forces directing the protests on the ground. But I think it's also important to look at these protests and Beijing's approach in the context of its relationship with the US, which has soured because of the trade war and the COVID-19 pandemic. Last year, the US Congress passed the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, which mandates an annual review on Hong Kong's autonomy that gives it its special trading status with the US. And that review is coming up. And the US National Security Advisor has said this law could warrant sanctions in Hong Kong and China. So I think China is looking at Hong Kong as increasingly a weak link in its national security that could potentially be exploited by the US.
Okay, still the protesters are talking about local issues. How are they likely to respond? And could we see a return to the huge demonstrations of last year?
Yes, I think it's important to remember what sparked those protests last year. It was a now withdrawn extradition bill that would have seen fugitives in Hong Kong sent to mainland China to face trial there. Now, people saw that as a challenge to Hong Kong's freedoms that it enjoys under one country, two systems. And this national security legislation is also seen as a challenge to Hong Kong's one country, two systems principle that gives it freedom of speech and the right to assembly, and those freedoms that you don't see on mainland China. And I think a lot of people here are really worried that those freedoms will be eroded by this new national security legislation. And so, yes, we're probably going to see more protests, as we saw yesterday.
Briefly, if you could, Laura, the law that we're talking about would give China the power to deploy security forces in Hong Kong. What does Beijing have in mind?
Yeah, a lot of things still need to be ironed out, but one of the proposals that has been announced is that the mainland could have agencies in Hong Kong, and potentially mainland agents operate in Hong Kong, enforcing this new national security legislation. Now, the Hong Kong government has said they would still be subject to local law, but many people have questioned how that would work. And obviously, it's got some people in Hong Kong quite worried because the mainland China does use national security legislation to go after journalists, activists, and even lawyers. So that announcement has got some people worried about how exactly that will work given Hong Kong's law structure and Hong Kong's system.
Laura Westbrook for us from the South China Morning Post. Thanks so much for coming in on this. Markets in Hong Kong fell right after this weekend's protests over that proposed national security bill for the former British colony. Here's more.
Hong Kong's Hang Seng stock index fell 1% on Monday after police used tear gas to quell weekend protests over a controversial national security bill. Gloom prevailed as US-China tensions ratcheted up and China's yuan currency lost value. And market players believe this could only be the beginning.
Hong Kong economy is being under rebound in May because of the success in containing the COVID-19 virus. But this will all be damaged by the national security law. And it depends on how the government control the riots. If the government takes a iron fist hand and jail as many protesters as possible, then the protests will gradually dwindle out.
Sentiment was also muted in the mainland, where the Shanghai Composite was largely unchanged. Most Asian bourses were lifted by signs the coronavirus lockdown is lifting. The Nikkei 225 in Tokyo rose 1.5%, and South Korea's Kospi index gained nearly 1%.